The crack of a gunshot echoed through the desolate Wyoming street as Catherine Blackburn watched her husband of 3 years gamble away their last dollar. Her stomach twisting with dread as his bloodshot eyes turned toward her the only thing of value he had left to wager. Wyoming Territory, 1873. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Copper Ridge. Catherine Blackburn pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling exposed despite the modest cut of her faded blue dress. At 22, she had already seen enough hardship to last a lifetime. The weight of her current predicament pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe in the stifling summer heat. "Frank, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the raucous laughter spilling from the saloon. "Let's just go home." Frank Blackburn's face contorted into an ugly sneer, his once handsome features twisted by drink and desperation. At 34, he looked a decade older, worn down by failed ventures and broken promises. "Home," he spat. "What home? That leaky one-room shack ain't worth the timber it's built with." His bloodshot eyes narrowed as he gripped her arm painfully. "Besides, I got a plan to turn our luck around." Catherine had heard these words too many times before. 3 years ago, when Frank had courted her with sweet words and grand promises, she'd believed him. The daughter of a struggling farmer, she'd seen marriage as an escape from poverty. How wrong she'd been. "Mr. Hargrove's waiting," Frank muttered, pulling her toward the imposing building at the end of the street. The sign above the door read Copper Ridge Mining Company, its freshly painted letters a stark contrast to the weathered buildings surrounding it. "What business do you have with Mr. Hargrove?" Catherine asked, her heart racing with apprehension. Frank didn't answer, just tightened his grip and quickened his pace. Inside the mining office, the air was noticeably cooler. Elaborate rugs covered the wooden floors, and a massive desk dominated the room. Behind it sat Edgar Hargrove, owner of the largest copper mine in the territory. At 55, he was barrel-chested with steel-gray hair and cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of profit and loss. "Blackburn," Hargrove acknowledged without rising, "I see you've brought your wife." Catherine felt his gaze travel over her like a physical touch, and she shuddered. "Like we discussed," Frank said, pushing Catherine forward slightly. "What's happening?" she demanded, looking between the two men. Hargrove smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Your husband owes me a considerable sum, Mrs. Blackburn. $400 in gambling debts, plus interest," Catherine gasped. The amount was astronomical, more than most men made in a year. "We don't have that kind of money," she protested. "Precisely why we've come to an alternative arrangement," Hargrove continued, opening a drawer and withdrawing a document. "Your husband has agreed to settle his debt by signing over your domestic services to me for the period of 1 year. The blood drained from Catherine's face. "My services? You'll work as a housekeeper in my residence," Hargrove clarified, though the gleam in his eyes suggested otherwise. "Room and board provided, of course. At the end of the year, the debt will be considered paid in full." Catherine turned to Frank, disbelief and betrayal washing over her in sickening waves. "You're selling me like a piece of property." Frank couldn't meet her eyes. "It's just for a year, Kath, and Hargrove's got a fine house. You'll eat better there than you ever did with me. I'm your wife," she cried, her voice breaking. "And I'm your husband, which means I have the legal right to make this decision," Frank shot back, a flicker of shame crossing his face before hardening into resentment. "What else am I supposed to do? Let them throw me in debtor's prison." Catherine looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape, but Hargrove had already placed the contract on the desk, an expensive fountain pen beside it. "The terms are quite favorable, considering the circumstances," Hargrove said smoothly. "Sign here, Blackburn." Frank stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the pen. The door to the office suddenly swung open, the sharp bang of it hitting the wall causing everyone to jump. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight that spilled into the room, momentarily obscuring the figure standing in the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt," said a deep voice, its tone suggesting he wasn't sorry at all. The man who stepped into the office was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscled build of someone who lived hard in the saddle. His clothes were trail-worn but clean dark pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster tied down against his thigh, marking him as someone who knew how to use it. His face was sun-darkened and weathered, partly shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "This is a private meeting," Hargrove said sharply. "State your business or leave." The stranger's eyes, a startling green that seemed out of place in his rugged face, swept the room, taking in the scene before him. They lingered on Catherine's frightened expression, noting the tears on her cheeks, before shifting to the contract on the desk. "Griffin Irwin," he introduced himself simply, ignoring Hargrove's demand. "Just rode into town." He moved further into the room with an easy, confident stride. "Couldn't help but overhear your negotiation." Frank bristled. "This ain't none of your concern, mister." Griffin Irwin raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not." His gaze returned to Catherine, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "But it strikes me as poor form to sell off your wife to cover gambling debts." Hargrove stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Mr. Irwin, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I suggest you leave before—" "How much?" Griffin interrupted. "Excuse me. The debt. How much is it?" Hargrove's eyes narrowed suspiciously. $400 plus 50 in interest. Why?" Griffin reached inside his vest and pulled out a leather wallet. From it, he extracted several bills and counted them deliberately onto the edge of the desk. $500, he said. "That covers the debt with interest, plus a little extra for your trouble." A shocked silence filled the room. Catherine stared at the money, then at the stranger, unable to comprehend what was happening. "What's your angle, Cowboy?" Hargrove demanded, though his eyes remained fixed on the cash. Griffin shrugged. "Let's just say I've got a particular dislike for men who treat women as property." He reached for the contract, picking it up and scanning it briefly. "This document's worthless anyway. No court would uphold it." "The money," Frank interjected, eyes gleaming with avarice. "Is it mine?" Griffin's expression hardened. "The money pays your debt to Mr. Hargrove, nothing more." He turned to Catherine. "Madam, I believe this concludes your business here. You're free to go." "Go where?" Frank sputtered. "She's my wife." "A wife you were willing to sell for a gambling debt," Griffin pointed out coldly. "I reckon that voids any claim you might have." Catherine found her voice at last. "I don't understand. Why would you do this for a stranger?" Griffin held her gaze steadily. "Sometimes a man just needs to do what's right." He turned to Hargrove. "Do we have a deal? The debt's paid and the lady walks out of here a free woman." Hargrove hesitated, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he nodded, sweeping the money into his desk drawer. "The debt is settled." His disappointment was palpable as he glared at Catherine. "Though I must say, Mrs. Blackburn, my offer of employment stands, should you find yourself in need of work." "She won't," Griffin said firmly. Frank lunged forward suddenly, his face contorted with rage. "You can't just walk in here and take my wife." Griffin's hand dropped to his gun, though he didn't draw it. "I'm not taking anyone. I'm giving the lady a choice." He looked at Catherine. "Madam," in that moment, Catherine felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She looked at Frank, the man who had promised to love and protect her, yet was willing to sell her to pay his debts, and felt the last threads of loyalty snap. "I'm leaving, Frank." she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Don't try to follow me." Frank's face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful enough," Griffin cut him off. "It's done." He gestured toward the door. "After you, Mrs. Blackburn." Catherine didn't look back as she stepped out into the harsh sunlight, her mind reeling. The stranger Griffin followed, closing the door firmly behind them. On the street, Catherine turned to face her unlikely rescuer. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Irwin." Griffin adjusted his hat against the glare of the sun. "No need for thanks, and it's just Griffin." He hesitated. "I realize you don't know me from Adam, but I can escort you wherever you need to go." Catherine felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. "That's just it. I have nowhere to go." She took a shaky breath. "Frank gambled away everything we had. The shack we lived in belongs to the mining company." Griffin frowned, considering this. "There's a boarding house at the edge of town. Respectable place from what I heard. I can pay for a room while you figure things out." "Why are you helping me?" Catherine asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Life had taught her that men rarely did anything without expecting something in return. Griffin's expression softened slightly. "Let's just say I've seen what happens to women with no options in towns like this." He glanced up and down the dusty street. "Besides, I've got business here that'll keep me around for a while. Helping you get on your feet seems like the Christian thing to do." Catherine studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Despite his rough appearance, there was something in his eyes she instinctively trusted, a steadiness, an honesty that Frank had never possessed. "I don't want charity," she said finally. "I can work. I've been taking in washing and mending to make ends meet for years." Griffin nodded. "Fair enough. Let's get you settled at the boarding house, and then we can figure out the rest." As they walked down the street side by side, Catherine felt the curious stares of townspeople. A woman walking with a strange man would certainly set tongues wagging, but for the first time in years, she found she didn't care what others thought. She was free unexpectedly, miraculously free and determined to make the most of this second chance. What she didn't know was that Griffin Irwin had his own reasons for being in Copper Ridge. Reasons that would soon entangle them both in a web of danger and desire neither could have anticipated. The boarding house was a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a wraparound porch adorned with hanging flower baskets. A hand-painted sign proclaimed Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, clean rooms, good food, respectable clientele. As they approached, an older woman appeared on the porch, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a lace cap, her expression curious but not unwelcoming. "Mrs. Holloway, I presume?" Griffin asked, removing his hat respectfully. "I am," she confirmed, her shrewd eyes moving between them. "And you would be, Griffin Irwin. This is Mrs. Catherine Blackburn. She's in need of accommodations." Mrs. Holloway's gaze sharpened. "I know who Mrs. Blackburn is. Is your husband aware of your whereabouts, my dear?" Catherine lifted her chin. "My husband and I are separated." "I see, Mrs." Holloway pursed her lips. "While I sympathize with your situation, Mrs. Blackburn, I do have a reputation to maintain. I cannot have a married woman staying here unaccompanied." "Mrs. Blackburn's circumstances are unusual," Griffin interjected smoothly. "Her husband attempted to settle a gambling debt by contracting her services to Edgar Hargrove." Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows shot up. "Did he indeed?" She studied Catherine with new interest. "That changes things considerably. Come inside, both of you." Inside, the boarding house was spotlessly clean, with simple but comfortable furnishings. Mrs. Holloway led them to a small sitting room at the back of the house, where they could speak privately. "Frank Blackburn always was a wastrel," Mrs. Holloway said once they were seated. "I warned your father against the match, Catherine, but he was eager to see you settled." Catherine blinked in surprise. "You knew my father. This is a small community, dear. I've been here since before you were born." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "Your mother and I were friends. She would be horrified to see what's become of your marriage." The mention of her mother, who had died when Catherine was 16, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "I made a mistake," she admitted quietly. "I should have listened to those who warned me about Frank." "What's done is done, Mrs. Holloway said pragmatically. "The question now is what you intend to do next. Mrs. Blackburn needs a safe place to stay while she establishes herself," Griffin explained. "I've offered to cover her expenses until she can support herself." Mrs. Holloway's eyes narrowed as she examined Griffin more carefully. "And what is your interest in this situation, Mr. Irwin?" "A simple desire to help someone in need," he replied, meeting her gaze steadily. Whatever Mrs. Holloway saw in his expression seemed to satisfy her. "Very well. I do have a room available, small but clean and private. The rate is $1 per day, meals included." "That's very reasonable," Griffin said, reaching for his wallet. "I'll pay you back," Catherine interjected quickly. "Every penny," Mrs. Holloway smiled. "I'm sure you will, dear. Now, let me show you to your room, and then perhaps you'd like to freshen up before supper. We eat at 6 sharp." After paying for a week's lodging in advance, Griffin excused himself, promising to return the following morning to discuss Catherine's options for employment. As Mrs. Holloway showed Catherine to a small but charming room on the second floor, the older woman's expression grew serious. "I should warn you, my dear, that your situation is precarious. Legally, you are still Frank's wife. If he chooses to assert his rights, there is little anyone can do to prevent him from claiming you." Catherine sat heavily on the edge of the narrow bed. "What can I do? For now, keep a low profile. I'll spread the word that you're under my protection, which will count for something in this town." Mrs. Holloway hesitated. "As for your mysterious benefactor, be cautious. He seems honorable enough, but men can have hidden motives." "I don't think he expects that," Catherine said, her cheeks warming. "He seems genuinely concerned, perhaps. But remember that a woman alone is vulnerable in more ways than one." With that cryptic warning, Mrs. Holloway left Catherine to settle in. Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Catherine tried to process the whirlwind of events that had upended her life in a single afternoon. Fear and uncertainty mingled with an unexpected sense of possibility. For the first time in years, she could imagine a future not dominated by Frank's failures and cruelties. If she was careful, if she worked hard, she might build something for herself. As she drifted toward sleep, the image of green eyes and a steady voice followed her into her dreams. Griffin Irwin was an enigma, a dangerous one, perhaps, but he had given her a chance at freedom, and for that, she would be forever grateful. When morning came, Catherine woke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains. For a moment, she lay disoriented, then remembered where she was and why. She dressed carefully in her one good dress, a navy blue cotton that had faded with washing but was still presentable, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Holloway was already bustling about the kitchen, the scent of coffee and frying bacon filling the air. 2 men in work clothes sat at the large dining table, nodding politely as Catherine entered. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Holloway greeted her. "Help yourself to coffee. Breakfast will be ready shortly." Catherine poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. Real coffee was a luxury she'd rarely enjoyed in recent years, Frank preferring to spend what little money they had on whiskey rather than household necessities. "I was thinking," Catherine said hesitantly, "perhaps I could help with the housekeeping, as partial payment for my room." Mrs. Holloway considered this as she flipped a pan of biscuits onto a plate. "That's not a bad idea. I could use the help, especially with the washing. My hands aren't what they used to be. Relief washed over Catherine. Thank you, I'm a hard worker, I promise. I know you are, dear. Your mother raised you right, whatever else might have happened. Mrs. Holloway paused, glancing toward the window. Your friend has arrived. Catherine turned to see Griffin approaching the boarding house. In the clear morning light, she could see him more clearly than the previous day. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck, and his face, though weathered, had a youthful quality she hadn't noticed before. She guessed him to be around 30, though it was difficult to tell with men who lived rough lives. Mrs. Holloway opened the door before he could knock. Good morning, Mr. Irwin. Join us for breakfast. Much obliged, madam, Griffin said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. His eyes found Catherine immediately, a slight smile warming his features. Mrs. Blackburn, I trust you slept well. Better than I have in some time, she admitted. Over a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits, they discussed Catherine's situation. Griffin listened attentively as she explained her arrangement with Mrs. Holloway. That's a good start, he agreed, but you'll need additional work if you want to be truly independent. I've been thinking about that, Catherine said. I'm a good seamstress. Perhaps I could take in mending, maybe even make dresses if I had the proper materials. Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. There's certainly a need for such services in town. The general store has a bulletin board where you could post a notice. I could help you set that up, Griffin offered. And perhaps make some inquiries around town. Sometimes the saloons need someone to repair costumes for their entertainers. Catherine hesitated but nodded. Work was work, and she couldn't afford to be overly particular. After breakfast, Griffin accompanied Catherine to the general store, where the proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, allowed her to post a notice offering her services as a seamstress. As they left, Catherine became aware of curious glances and whispered conversations among the townspeople they passed. People are talking about us, she said quietly. Griffin's expression remained impassive. Small towns run on gossip. They'll find something else to talk about soon enough. It's not just that. Catherine stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face her. Why are you really helping me, Mr. Irwin? And don't tell me it's just Christian charity. Men like you don't ride into town and spend $500 on strangers without a reason. For a long moment, Griffin said nothing, his green eyes studying her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. Finally, he sighed. I came to Copper Ridge looking for someone, he admitted. A man named Hargrove. Catherine's eyes widened. Edgar Hargrove, the mine owner. Griffin nodded. 5 years ago, Hargrove owned a silver mine in Nevada. There was an incident. A cave in that killed 12 men, including my younger brother. I'm so sorry, Catherine said softly. The official report called it an accident, but it wasn't. Hargrove had been warned about unsafe conditions, but he ignored the warnings to keep production high. When the mine collapsed, he bribed officials to cover it up. Griffin's jaw tightened. I've spent the last 5 years gathering evidence, tracking Hargrove as he moved from Nevada to Colorado, and now here. What do you plan to do? Bring him to justice, legally if possible. His eyes darkened. When I saw what he was doing to you, treating you like just another commodity to be bought and sold, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. It might have compromised my purpose here, but some things are more important than vengeance. Catherine absorbed this, understanding now the righteous anger she had sensed in him. So you weren't just being kind, you were striking at Hargrove. Both can be true, Griffin said quietly. I didn't have to help you to get to Hargrove, but seeing you there about to be traded like cattle. It reminded me of all the reasons I'm hunting him. He destroys lives without a second thought. Before Catherine could respond, A commotion down the street caught their attention. A group of men had emerged from the saloon, Frank Blackburn among them. When he spotted Catherine and Griffin, he broke away from his companions and staggered toward them, clearly drunk despite the early hour. "There's my faithless wife," he called loudly, drawing the attention of everyone on the street. "Run off with the first stranger who flashed some cash." Griffin stepped slightly in front of Catherine, his posture relaxed but alert. "You're drunk, Blackburn. Go sleep it off." Frank's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me what to do, Cowboy. She's my wife and I'm taking her home." "I'm not going anywhere with you, Frank," Catherine said firmly, though her hands trembled. "You forfeited any right to call yourself my husband when you tried to sell me to Hargrove." Frank lunged forward suddenly, grabbing for Catherine's arm. Griffin moved with surprising speed, catching Frank's wrist in a grip that made the other man wince. "That's not how a gentleman treats a lady," Griffin said, his voice deceptively soft. "She ain't no lady," Frank spat. "Just a farmer's daughter who got above herself." Griffin's expression hardened. "I'm only going to say this once, Blackburn. Leave Mrs. Blackburn alone. If you approach her again, you'll answer to me." "Is that a threat?" Frank demanded, though he made no move to break free of Griffin's grip. "It's a promise." For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Frank wrenched his arm away, backing up a step. "This ain't over," he muttered, before turning and stumbling back toward the saloon. As the crowd of onlookers dispersed, Catherine let out a shaky breath. "He won't let this go. When he's been drinking, he has a temper." Griffin's expression softened with concern. "Did he hurt you? Before, I mean." Catherine looked away, unwilling to admit the extent of Frank's cruelty. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters to me," Griffin said quietly. The sincerity in his voice made Catherine look up, meeting his gaze. Something passed between them, a current of understanding and connection that startled her with its intensity. "We should get back to the boarding house," she said, breaking the moment. "Mrs. Holloway will be wondering where I am." As they walked, Catherine found herself acutely aware of Griffin beside her, his measured stride, the subtle scent of leather and bay rum, the way his presence made her feel simultaneously unsettled and secure. It was disconcerting to realize how quickly this stranger had become important to her. What was even more disconcerting was the knowledge that his purpose in Copper Ridge had nothing to do with her, and that once he had achieved his goal of bringing Hargrove to justice, he would leave. The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. Back at the boarding house, Catherine threw herself into work, helping Mrs. Holloway with the laundry and mending a torn curtain in the parlor. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from her turbulent thoughts. That evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, Mrs. Holloway handed Catherine a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Catherine asked, surprised. "Open it and see," the older woman encouraged. Inside, Catherine found several spools of thread in various colors, a packet of needles, a pair of small sewing scissors, and a thimble. "I thought you might need these for your seamstress work," Mrs. Holloway explained. "Consider it an investment in your future." Tears pricked Catherine's eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. I'll pay you back as soon as I start earning." "There's no rush, dear." Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "I've also spoken with Reverend Miller's wife. She needs a new dress for the church social next month and would like to hire you to make it." "That's wonderful," Catherine exclaimed. "A commission from the minister's wife would give her credibility with other potential customers." "Yes. Well, it seems your Mr. Irwin put in a good word for you," Mrs. Holloway said with a knowing smile. "He spent the afternoon visiting various establishments in town, singing your praises as a seamstress." "He's not my Mr. Irwin," Catherine protested, feeling her cheeks warm. Mrs. Holloway merely raised an eyebrow. "If you say so, dear." She rose from her chair. "I think I'll retire early tonight. These old bones need their rest." Left alone in the parlor, Catherine found her thoughts returning to Griffin. His admission about his brother and his quest for justice had helped her understand him better, but it had also complicated her feelings. She was grateful for his help, admired his principles, and was undeniably drawn to him, but she was also a married woman, legally if not emotionally bound to Frank. Moreover, she had rushed into marriage once before, blinded by sweet words and empty promises. She would not make the same mistake again, especially with a man whose life was dedicated to a dangerous purpose. The following days fell into a pattern. Catherine divided her time between helping Mrs. Holloway and working on sewing commissions, which began to trickle in as word of her skill spread. Griffin continued his discreet investigation into Hargrove's business practices, occasionally bringing Catherine news of his progress. They often walked together in the evenings, talking about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Catherine learned that Griffin had been a rancher in Texas before his brother's death had set him on his current path, and that he dreamed of returning to that life someday. He, in turn, listened as she spoke of her childhood on her father's struggling farm, her brief time as a schoolteacher before her marriage, and her desire to someday have children. "You'd make a wonderful mother," Griffin said one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I hope so," Catherine replied softly. "I always wanted a family of my own, a real family built on love and respect." Griffin's eyes held hers. "You deserve that, Catherine, and so much more." The way he said her name with such warmth and sincerity made her heart flutter. In the weeks since her rescue from Hargrove's office, something had changed between them. What had begun as a charitable impulse on his part and desperate gratitude on hers had evolved into genuine friendship, and, at least on Catherine's side, something deeper. She tried to remind herself that their connection was temporary, that Griffin would leave once his business with Hargrove was concluded. But such thoughts did little to quell the growing feelings she harbored for him. As for Griffin, if he felt anything beyond friendship, he kept it carefully hidden. Always respectful, never presuming, he maintained a certain distance that both frustrated and relieved Catherine. After all, until she found a way to legally end her marriage to Frank, anything more than friendship between them would be improper. Frank, meanwhile, had made several attempts to confront Catherine, sometimes pleading for reconciliation, other times threatening to force her return. Each time, Griffin had intervened, his quiet authority usually enough to send Frank skulking away. But the confrontations were becoming more frequent and more volatile, leaving Catherine constantly on edge. One morning, as Catherine was returning from delivering a completed dress to Mrs. Miller, she found herself cornered by Frank in an alley between the church and the general store. "You've made a fool of me," Frank hissed, his breath reeking of alcohol despite the early hour. "The whole town's laughing, saying my wife ran off with that gunslinger." "That's not true," Catherine protested, trying to edge past him. "Griffin is a friend, nothing more." Frank laughed bitterly. "A friend who pays your bills. Don't take me for an idiot, Kath." "Let me pass, Frank," Catherine said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I have nothing more to say to you." "I'm still your husband," Frank growled, grabbing her arm roughly. "Till death do us part, remember? You took vows before God." "Vows you broke when you gambled away our livelihood and tried to sell me like property," Catherine retorted, trying to pull free of his grip. "Let go of me." Frank's face darkened with rage. He raised his hand to strike her, but before the blow could fall, A voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Blackburn." Griffin stood at the mouth of the alley, his expression cold, hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Frank froze, then slowly lowered his hand. "This is between me and my wife." "Not anymore," Griffin said, stepping closer. "I've been patient, giving you chances to behave like a man instead of a drunken bully. That patience has run out." Something in Griffin's tone, a deadly calm that promised violence, finally penetrated Frank's alcohol-fogged mind. He released Catherine's arm and backed away. "You can't protect her forever, Irwin," he spat. "She's still legally mine." "Not for long," Griffin replied evenly. "Mrs. Blackburn has consulted with Judge Wilson about obtaining a divorce on grounds of cruelty and desertion." Catherine's eyes widened in surprise. This was the first she'd heard of any such consultation. Frank's face contorted with fury. "No judge would grant it. I never deserted her, she left me." "After you tried to sell her to Hargrove," Griffin pointed out. "The judge found that. Interesting. He's inclined to view it as desertion of marital responsibility, if not physical desertion." Frank lunged suddenly, not at Catherine but at Griffin, swinging wildly. Griffin sidestepped easily, catching Frank's arm and using his momentum to slam him against the alley wall. "That was a mistake," Griffin said, his voice dangerously soft as he pinned Frank against the rough bricks. "Griffin, don't," Catherine cried, fearing he might seriously hurt Frank. Griffin glanced at her, then back at Frank. "You're lucky your wife has a compassionate nature, Blackburn. I'm less inclined to forgive." He released Frank with a slight shove. "Leave town, today. If I see you again, I won't be so merciful." Frank staggered slightly, rubbing his shoulder where it had hit the wall. For a moment, hatred blazed in his eyes, but something in Griffin's steady gaze must have convinced him of the seriousness of the threat. Without another word, he pushed past them and disappeared around the corner. As soon as he was gone, Catherine's composure crumbled. She began to shake, tears filling her eyes. Griffin was at her side instantly, his hands gentle as he examined her arm where Frank had gripped her. "Did he hurt you?" "And no, just frightened me," she managed, fighting to control her tears. "Did you really speak to Judge Wilson about a divorce?" Griffin nodded, his expression softening. "I took the liberty of making an appointment for you. The judge is sympathetic to your situation, especially after hearing about Hargrove's contract." Catherine stared at him, overwhelmed by this unexpected development. "A divorce would free me legally, but the scandal. No respectable woman gets divorced." "No respectable husband tries to sell his wife," Griffin countered. "Besides, times are changing, Catherine. You deserve a chance at happiness, not a lifetime shackled to a man who treats you like property." His concern for her future touched Catherine deeply. Most men would have simply walked away once the immediate crisis was resolved, but Griffin had gone out of his way to secure her a path to true freedom. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Griffin smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. "You're welcome. Now, let's get you back to Mrs. Holloway's. You've had enough excitement for one day." As they walked side by side through the busy Main Street, Catherine was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Her reputation was already compromised by her separation from Frank and her association with Griffin. A divorce would only cement her status as a social outcast in the small community. Yet, for the first time in years, Catherine found she didn't care what others thought. The possibility of freedom, true freedom to build a life of her own choosing, was worth any amount of gossip and disapproval. What she couldn't quite admit, even to herself, was that her growing feelings for Griffin were an equally powerful motivation. The thought of him leaving once his business with Hargrove was concluded had become increasingly painful. If she were free, truly free. but that was dangerous thinking. Griffin had never expressed any romantic interest in her, and even if he had feelings for her, his quest for justice against Hargrove remained his priority. Once that was accomplished, he would likely return to Texas and the ranching life he missed. Catherine pushed these thoughts aside as they reached the boarding house. She had immediate concerns to address, namely, her appointment with Judge Wilson and the possibility of a divorce. One step at a time, she told herself firmly. First freedom, then the future. The meeting with Judge Wilson took place the following afternoon in his chambers at the small courthouse. A stern-faced man with bushy white eyebrows, the judge listened attentively as Catherine explained her situation, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. "What you describe constitutes abandonment and cruelty under territorial law," he said when she had finished. "The attempted sale of your domestic services to Mr. Hargrove is particularly troubling." "Then you'll grant the divorce?" Catherine asked hopefully. The judge sighed. "It's not quite that simple, Mrs. Blackburn. I am inclined to rule in your favor, but there are procedures to follow. Your husband must be formally notified and given an opportunity to contest the divorce." Catherine's heart sank. What if he refuses to accept the notification? Or what if he's left town, as Mr. Irwin suggested? In that case, after a reasonable effort to locate him, we can proceed with publication of notice in the newspaper. After 6 weeks, if there's no response, I can grant the divorce by default. The judge peered at her over his spectacles. "However, I must caution you that divorce carries a significant social stigma, particularly for women." "I understand, Your Honor," Catherine said quietly, "but I cannot return to a man who would sell me to pay his gambling debts." Judge Wilson nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Very well. I'll have my clerk prepare the necessary papers. You'll need to sign them and pay a filing fee of $2. $2, a significant sum for Catherine, but one she could now afford thanks to her growing seamstress business. She had already completed dresses for Mrs. Miller and 2 other ladies in town, and had several more commissions lined up. "Thank you, Your Honor," Catherine said, rising to leave. "One more thing, Mrs. Blackburn," the judge added. "Until your divorce is finalized, I strongly advise you to maintain the utmost propriety in your behavior. Any indiscretions could prejudice your case." Catherine felt her cheeks warm, knowing he was referring to her association with Griffin. "I assure you, Your Honor, there has been nothing improper in my conduct. See that it remains so," the judge said firmly. "Good day, Mrs. Blackburn." Outside the courthouse, Griffin was waiting, leaning against a hitching post. He straightened when he saw her, searching her expression. "How did it go?" "The judge is willing to grant the divorce, but it will take time," Catherine explained. "Frank must be notified first." Griffin nodded thoughtfully. "I doubt he's still in town, but we can have the sheriff check. And if he's gone, then they'll publish a notice in the newspaper. After a certain period, if he doesn't respond, you'll get your divorce by default." Griffin offered his arm. "Shall we?" Catherine hesitated, remembering the judge's warning about maintaining propriety. "Perhaps we shouldn't be seen walking arm in arm," she said reluctantly. "The judge cautioned me about appearances while the divorce is pending." Understanding flickered in Griffin's eyes. "Of course. Forgive me." He took a step back, maintaining a respectful distance as they began walking. The small space between them felt like a chasm to Catherine, who had grown accustomed to his closeness. But she knew the judge was right. Her reputation was already damaged, and any hint of impropriety with Griffin could jeopardize her divorce. "Mr. Irwin," a voice called from behind them. They turned to see a young man hurrying toward them, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Irwin, sir, Mrs. Holloway sent me to find you," the boy panted. "There's a man asking for you at the boarding house. Says it's urgent. Griffin frowned. Did he give a name? Yes, sir. Said his name was Michaels. Thomas Michaels. Recognition flashed across Griffin's face. Tell Mrs. Holloway I'll be there directly. He turned to Catherine. I need to go. Michaels is an associate who's been helping me gather evidence against Hargrove. Go, Catherine urged. I'll finish my errands and meet you back at the boarding house. Griffin hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to her and his mission. Are you sure? After what happened with Frank earlier. Frank is gone and I'll be careful, Catherine assured him. Besides, I'm just going to the general store and then straight back to Mrs. Holloway's. What trouble could I possibly get into? Griffin still looked uncertain but nodded. All right. But if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, go directly to the sheriff's office. Promise me. I promise, Catherine said, touched by his concern. With a final nod, Griffin turned and strode quickly in the direction of the boarding house, leaving Catherine to continue on to the general store alone. The general store was busy with mid-afternoon shoppers. Catherine moved efficiently through the crowded aisles, selecting the items she needed for her sewing project's buttons, trim, and a length of calico for Mrs. Peterson's daughter's dress. As she approached the counter to pay, she noticed Edgar Hargrove engaged in conversation with the proprietor, Mr. Jenkins. The mine owner's back was to her, but there was no mistaking his broad shoulders and expensive suit. Catherine hesitated, reluctant to face the man who had so nearly become her master. She was about to retreat and return later when Hargrove turned, his cold eyes finding her immediately. Mrs. Blackburn, he acknowledged with a thin smile. What a pleasant surprise. Catherine nodded stiffly. Mr. Hargrove. I understand congratulations are in order, Hargrove continued, his tone deceptively pleasant. Word around town is that you're seeking a divorce. Quite the modern woman, aren't you? The implication that she was somehow improper or immoral was clear. Catherine felt her cheeks flush, but kept her voice steady. My personal affairs are not a matter for public discussion, Mr. Hargrove. On the contrary, my dear, when a woman leaves her lawful husband to take up with a mysterious stranger, it becomes the talk of the town. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes, especially when that stranger has been asking pointed questions about my business affairs. A chill ran down Catherine's spine. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Hargrove stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Your Mr. Irwin has been quite busy, poking his nose where it doesn't belong. It would be a shame if his investigation were to cause problems for those he cares about. The threat was unmistakable. Catherine fought to keep her expression neutral, even as fear tightened her chest. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Hargrove, I have errands to complete. Hargrove didn't move. A word of friendly advice, Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Irwin is not what he appears to be. Men like him bring nothing but trouble to women foolish enough to trust them. And men like you bring nothing but misery to those unfortunate enough to work for them, Catherine retorted, her patience snapping. Now please step aside. Surprise flickered across Hargrove's face, quickly replaced by cold anger. You should mind your tongue, Mrs. Blackburn. This is a small town, and I have considerable influence. It would be a simple matter to ensure that no respectable person would hire you for your sewing services. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hargrove? Merely stating facts. Hargrove finally moved aside, allowing her to pass. Give my regards to Mr. Irwin. Tell him I look forward to our next meeting. Catherine paid for her purchases with shaking hands, acutely aware of Hargrove's gaze following her as she left the store. Outside, she took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to calm her racing heart. Hargrove's words echoed in her mind. He knew about Griffin's investigation, which meant Griffin was in danger. She needed to warn him immediately. Clutching her parcels, Catherine hurried toward the boarding house, her mind whirling with fear and determination. She had just reached the corner of Main Street when a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and she was dragged backward into the shadowed space between two buildings. "Make a sound and you're dead," a harsh voice whispered in her ear. Catherine froze, terror washing through her as she felt the cold press of a gun barrel against her ribs. Her assailant pulled her deeper into the alley, away from the busy street where someone might see them. "That's better," the man said, removing his hand from her mouth but keeping the gun firmly pressed against her. "Now, Mrs. Blackburn, you and I are going to have a little chat about your friend Irwin." Catherine turned her head slightly, trying to see her captor's face. He was a stranger, a hard-faced man with a scar running from his left eye to the corner of his mouth. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her effort to appear brave. "What do you want?" "Names aren't important," the man replied coldly. "As for what I want, information. Where is Irwin meeting his contact?" The man named Michaels. Understanding dawned. This man worked for Hargrove. He must have overheard the boy delivering the message about Michael's arrival. "I don't know what you're talking about," Catherine said, desperately playing for time. The man's grip tightened painfully on her arm. "Don't lie to me, woman. I heard the message." Where are they meeting? Catherine's mind raced. If she told him, both Griffin and his informant would be in danger. If she refused, the pressure of the gun against her side was an explicit threat. "They're meeting at the boarding house," she said finally, hoping that the public setting might afford some protection. "Mrs. Holloway's place at the edge of town." The man cursed under his breath. "Too many witnesses there. When are they leaving? Where will they go next?" "I don't know," Catherine insisted, and this time it was the truth. "Griffin, Mr. Irwin doesn't share his plans with me." "But you're his woman," the man said skeptically. "I'm not his woman," Catherine corrected, flushing. "We're merely acquaintances." The man studied her face, apparently trying to determine if she was lying. Whatever he saw must have convinced him, for he nodded slowly. "All right, here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice hard. "You're going to go back to the boarding house and tell Irwin that Hargrove wants to meet with him. Alone. Tonight at midnight at the old Silver Creek Bridge." "And why would he agree to that?" Catherine asked, fear giving way to anger. The man smiled unpleasantly, the scar on his face twisting with the expression. "Because if he doesn't, you'll suffer for it. Hargrove hasn't forgotten how Irwin interfered with his plans for you. He's eager to even the score." "I won't do it," Catherine said, her voice stronger now. "I won't lure Griffin into a trap." The man shrugged, as if her refusal was of no consequence. "Have it your way." He raised the gun, pressing it more firmly against her side. "I can deliver the message myself after I've eliminated the complication." Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she realized he meant to kill her. "Wait, I'll do it. I'll deliver your message." "Smart girl," the man said, lowering the gun slightly. "Remember, midnight at Silver Creek Bridge. Irwin comes alone or there'll be consequences. And Mrs. Blackburn." His grip on her arm tightened once more. "If you warn him, if you try to be clever, well, let's just say Hargrove has men watching the boarding house. We'll know." With that, he shoved her roughly toward the street. "Go on now, deliver your message." Catherine stumbled forward, her parcels clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't look back as she hurried away, afraid that if she did, her terror would be plainly visible on her face. Her mind worked frantically as she walked toward the boarding house. She had to warn Griffin, but how? If Hargrove's men were watching, any attempt to alert Griffin to the danger would put them both at risk. By the time she reached the boarding house, Catherine had formed the beginnings of a plan. It was risky, desperate even, but it was the only way she could see to save Griffin without alerting Hargrove's men. Mrs. Holloway met her at the door, her expression worried. "There you are, dear. Mr. Irwin was getting concerned about your delay." "I'm fine," Catherine assured her, forcing a smile. "Just got caught up at the general store. Is Mr. Irwin with his visitor?" "Yes, they're in the small parlor at the back. I've given them privacy as Mr. Irwin requested." Catherine nodded, setting her parcels on a side table. "I should let him know I've returned safely." She made her way to the back parlor, pausing outside the closed door to gather her courage. From within, she could hear low voices engaged in intense conversation. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly. The voices fell silent immediately. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Griffin, his expression guarded until he recognized her. "Catherine," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I was beginning to worry." "I'm sorry for the delay," she said, stepping into the room. There was a queue at the general store. Inside, a thin, nervous-looking man with spectacles sat in one of the armchairs. He rose when Catherine entered, nodding politely. "Mrs. Blackburn, I presume? Thomas Michaels." He glanced at Griffin. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion later." Griffin hesitated, looking between them. "Is everything all right, Catherine? You seem tense." This was at the moment Catherine had to make her decision. If she warned Griffin now, Hargrove's men might be watching through the windows, listening at doors. But if she delivered the false message as instructed, she would be sending Griffin into an ambush. "Actually," she said carefully, "I ran into Mr. Hargrove at the general store. He asked me to deliver a message to you." Griffin's expression sharpened. "Did he now? What kind of message?" "He wants to meet with you," Catherine said, her heart pounding. "Tonight at midnight at the old Silver Creek Bridge, alone." "That's clearly a trap," Michaels interjected, looking alarmed. Griffin's eyes never left Catherine's face. "And what do you think, Catherine?" Catherine swallowed hard. "I think." She paused, choosing her words with extreme care. "I think Mr. Hargrove was very insistent that you come alone. He seemed to believe you would agree for my sake." Something in her tone or expression must have alerted Griffin, for his gaze intensified, searching her face. "For your sake? Did he threaten you?" Catherine hesitated, then nodded slightly, her eyes conveying what she couldn't say aloud, that there was more to the situation than she could safely explain. Griffin's jaw tightened. "I see. Thank you for delivering the message, Catherine." He turned to Michaels. "It seems I have an appointment to keep tonight." "Griffin, you can't seriously be considering—" Michaels began, but Griffin cut him off with a sharp gesture. "We'll discuss the details later, Tom." His tone made it clear the subject was closed for now. Catherine understood that Griffin had received her unspoken warning and was now playing along for the benefit of any watching eyes or listening ears. "If you'll excuse me," she said, "I should take my purchases upstairs." Griffin nodded, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes conveyed concern and a silent promise to seek her out later for a more candid conversation. As Catherine left the room, closing the door behind her, she could only hope that Griffin had understood the true danger and that together they could find a way to outmaneuver Hargrove before it was too late. The remainder of the afternoon passed in an agony of suspense for Catherine. She busied herself with her sewing, trying to appear normal while constantly aware that Hargrove's men might be watching the boarding house. When Griffin and Michaels emerged from the back parlor, their expressions were grave. Michaels took his leave shortly thereafter, slipping out the back door with a final murmured conversation with Griffin. As evening approached, Mrs. Holloway announced dinner, her observant eyes moving between Catherine and Griffin as they took their places at the table, noting the tension that vibrated between them. "Is everything all right, dears?" she inquired, setting a steaming pot of stew in the center of the table. "Just fine, Mrs. Holloway." Griffin replied with a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. Business matters, nothing more. Mrs. Holloway looked unconvinced but didn't press the issue. Throughout the meal, Catherine and Griffin maintained a facade of normalcy, discussing inconsequential matters while carefully avoiding any mention of Hargrove or the supposed midnight meeting. After dinner, Griffin excused himself, saying he needed to tend to his horse at the livery stable. The message was clear: he needed to make preparations for the night ahead without arousing suspicion. Catherine retreated to her room, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan. She couldn't let Griffin face Hargrove's men alone, but what could she do? She had no weapon, no training in confrontation. Her only advantage was that no one would expect her to involve herself in the danger. As darkness fell, Catherine changed into her darkest dress and tied her hair back with a ribbon. From her sewing basket, she selected a pair of small, sharp scissors, a poor weapon, but better than nothing. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, waiting for the house to quiet. Just after 11, a soft knock came at her door. Catherine opened it to find Griffin, dressed in dark clothing, his gun belt strapped to his thigh. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Catherine hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of allowing a man into her bedroom, but nodded. The circumstances were hardly conventional. Once inside, Griffin kept his voice low. "Tell me exactly what happened today. The real version, not the one you felt safe giving in public." Catherine quickly recounted her encounter with Hargrove's thug in the alley, including the threat against her life if Griffin was warned. "I couldn't tell you openly," she explained. "They're watching the house, but I couldn't let you walk into their trap unaware." Griffin's expression darkened with anger, though Catherine knew it wasn't directed at her. "You did the right thing," he assured her, "and you were incredibly brave." "What are you going to do?" she asked, fear evident in her voice despite her efforts to control it. "Spring their trap," Griffin said simply. "But on my terms, not Hargrove's." "How?" "Tom Michaels is arranging for the sheriff and several deputies to be positioned near the bridge out of sight. When Hargrove's men make their move, they'll find themselves outnumbered." Relief flooded through Catherine. "Then you won't be facing them alone." "No." Griffin's expression softened as he looked at her. "But I need you to stay here where it's safe. Promise me you won't try to follow or interfere." Catherine wanted to protest, to insist on accompanying him, but the logic of his request was undeniable. Her presence would only complicate an already dangerous situation. "I promise," she said reluctantly. Griffin reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before dropping back to his side. "When this is over, when Hargrove has been dealt with." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "We need to talk about the future, your future, and perhaps ours." Catherine's heart leaped at the implication, even as she tried to temper her hope. "You still plan to return to Texas?" "That depends," Griffin said quietly, "on whether I have a reason to stay." The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken feelings and possibilities. Catherine found herself leaning toward him, drawn by an irresistible force. Griffin stepped back abruptly, breaking the spell. "I should go. The sheriff will be waiting." "Be careful," Catherine whispered, fighting the urge to reach for him, to hold him back from the danger he was walking into. Griffin nodded, his eyes lingering on her face as if memorizing her features. "Lock your door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but Mrs. Holloway until I return." With that, he slipped out of the room, his footsteps fading as he descended the stairs. Catherine locked the door as instructed, then moved to the window, watching as Griffin's shadowy figure emerged from the boarding house and disappeared into the darkness. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Catherine paced her small room, alternating between worry for Griffin's safety and hope for what might happen once Hargrove was brought to justice. The possibility that Griffin might stay in Copper Ridge, that they might have a future together once her divorce was finalized, filled her with both excitement and trepidation. She had just begun to believe that her promise to remain safely at the boarding house might not be so difficult to keep when she heard the distinctive sound of breaking glass from the floor below. Catherine froze, listening intently. Another crash, followed by Mrs. Holloway's frightened cry, galvanized her into action. She grabbed her small scissors and hurried to the door, pressing her ear against it. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. A gruff voice called out, "Check all the rooms, find the woman." Hargrove had sent men to the boarding house likely as insurance in case Griffin somehow survived the ambush at the bridge. And now Mrs. Holloway was in danger because of her. Catherine's mind raced. Her room was at the end of the hall, which meant the intruders would search the other rooms first. She had perhaps a minute, maybe less, to act. The window. It was her only escape route. Catherine rushed to the window, throwing it open. A small overhang extended beneath it, part of the porch roof. If she could climb out and lower herself to the edge, she might be able to drop safely to the ground. Behind her, the sound of a door being kicked in spurred her to action. Catherine climbed through the window, her heart pounding as she carefully eased herself onto the sloping roof. The night air was cool against her face as she inched toward the edge, praying the aged shingles would support her weight. At the edge of the overhang, Catherine hesitated. The drop to the ground looked much higher from her current position than it had from the window. Taking a deep breath, she lowered herself as far as possible, hanging by her fingertips, then let go. The impact when she hit the ground knocked the breath from her lungs. For a terrifying moment, she lay stunned, certain that the noise of her fall would alert the intruders. But the sounds of their search continued unabated from within the house. Scrambling to her feet, Catherine hurried around the side of the building, keeping to the shadows. She needed to find help, to warn Griffin that Hargrove's plan was more extensive than they had anticipated. The sheriff's office was several blocks away, but if Griffin's plan had worked, the sheriff would be at the Silver Creek Bridge. Her best option was to go there directly and hope she wasn't too late. Catherine set off at a run, grateful for the cover of darkness as she made her way through the sleeping town. The bridge was almost a mile outside Copper Ridge, spanning a deep ravine where Silver Creek cut through rocky terrain on its way to join the larger river in the valley. As she ran, Catherine berated herself for not anticipating Hargrove's duplicity. Of course, he would have a contingency plan. Men like Hargrove didn't rise to power without covering every possibility. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, Catherine's lungs burned and a stitch in her side made each step painful, but she pushed on, driven by fear for Griffin and determination to reach him before it was too late. The road to the bridge wound through scrubby terrain, the path illuminated only by the half-moon overhead. Catherine slowed her pace, moving more cautiously now, aware that she was approaching the area where Hargrove's ambush was set. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of the bridge, a simple wooden structure spanning the ravine. As she drew closer, she caught the faint sound of voices, then a shout, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Catherine's heart seemed to stop. The ambush had been sprung. Caution forgotten, she ran toward the sounds of conflict, desperate to know if Griffin was alive, if the sheriff's men had arrived in time. As she crested a small rise, the scene below came into view. Several figures struggled near the bridge, illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern that had been knocked to the ground. Catherine could make out Griffin, his back to a large boulder, exchanging fire with two men who had taken cover behind a stand of scrubby pine trees. Of the sheriff and his deputies, there was no sign. The realization hit Catherine like a physical blow. The sheriff hadn't come. Either Michaels had failed to convince him, or Hargrove's influence had prevented official intervention. Griffin was alone, outnumbered, and fighting for his life. Even as she watched, a third man emerged from the shadows at the far end of the bridge, circling to flank Griffin's position. From his angle, Griffin couldn't see the new threat approaching. Without thinking, Catherine snatched up a rock from the ground and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the creek near the approaching man, the clatter causing him to whirl around, his gun raised. "Griffin! Behind you!" Catherine shouted, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Griffin reacted instantly, spinning to face the new threat just as the man fired. The bullet whined past Griffin's head as he dove for cover, returning fire in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice. The man jerked backward, clutching his shoulder, his gun falling from suddenly limp fingers. Catherine's warning had saved Griffin, but it had also revealed her presence. One of the men behind the pine trees spotted her and swung his weapon in her direction. "Run!" Griffin shouted, firing rapidly to provide her with covering fire. Catherine turned to flee, but her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling to the ground. She scrambled to rise, but knew she wouldn't be fast enough to escape the bullet she could almost feel coming for her. The expected shot never came. Instead, new voices joined the chaos, authoritative shouts demanding that weapons be lowered. The sheriff had arrived after all, accompanied by several deputies. They converged on the scene from multiple directions, cutting off any escape route for Hargrove's men. In the confusion, Catherine felt strong arms lift her to her feet. Griffin's face, taut with concern and anger, appeared before her. "I told you to stay at the boarding house," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What are you doing here?" "Hargrove sent men there too," Catherine explained breathlessly. "They were searching for me. I had to escape through the window." Griffin's expression darkened. "Mrs. Holloway?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted, fear for the kind landlady constricting her throat. "I heard her cry out, but I couldn't help her without being caught myself." "You did the right thing," Griffin assured her, though his jaw was tight with suppressed fury. "We need to get back to town now." The sheriff approached them, his weathered face grave. "Irwin, we've got 3 of Hargrove's men in custody, including one who claims he was just following orders. He's willing to testify against Hargrove in exchange for leniency." "Good," Griffin nodded. "But there are more at the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway may be in danger." The sheriff cursed under his breath. "Johnson, Davis," he called to 2 of his deputies, "ride back to town immediately. Secure Mrs. Holloway's boarding house and arrest anyone who doesn't belong there." The deputies mounted their horses and galloped away, heading back toward Copper Ridge. "What about Hargrove?" Griffin demanded. "No sign of him at the ambush site," the sheriff admitted. "But with testimony from his men and the evidence you and Michaels have gathered, we have enough to arrest him. I've sent men to his home and the mining office." Griffin nodded, though he looked far from satisfied. "We need to get Catherine somewhere safe until this is resolved." "My office," the sheriff suggested. "It's the most secure building in town, and I'll leave a deputy on guard." The ride back to town was tense, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Catherine couldn't help but wonder if this night would ever truly end, or if Hargrove's reach would continue to threaten them even after his men were in custody. At the sheriff's office, they found Thomas Michaels waiting, his thin face drawn with anxiety. "Thank God you're alive," he exclaimed when he saw Griffin. "When I heard the shooting start before the sheriff arrived, I feared the worst." "What delayed them?" Griffin asked, helping Catherine from the horse they had shared. "Hargrove's influence," Michaels explained bitterly. The sheriff was reluctant to move against such a prominent citizen without ironclad evidence. It took longer than expected to convince him. "And Mrs. Holloway?" Catherine asked anxiously. "Have you heard anything?" Before Michaels could respond, the door to the office burst open, and one of the deputies who had been sent to the boarding house entered. "Sheriff, we secured the boarding house. 2 of Hargrove's men were taken into custody." The deputy hesitated, his expression grim. "Mrs. Holloway was injured in the initial confrontation. The doctor's with her now." "How bad?" Catherine demanded, her voice breaking. "She took a blow to the head when she resisted," the deputy reported. "The doctor says she's unconscious but stable. He's hopeful for a full recovery." Catherine sagged with relief, though guilt still gnawed at her. If she hadn't been staying at the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway would never have been in danger. Griffin seemed to sense her thoughts. "This isn't your fault," he said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The blame lies entirely with Hargrove." "Speaking of Hargrove," the sheriff interjected, "there's still no sign of him. His house was empty and the night watchman at the mining office hasn't seen him." "He's running," Griffin said with certainty. "He knows his scheme failed and his men are talking. He won't risk staying in Copper Ridge." The sheriff nodded grimly. "I've sent telegrams to neighboring towns to be on the lookout, and I've got men watching the roads. If he's still in the area, we'll find him." Despite these assurances, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that Hargrove was too cunning to be caught so easily. As long as he remained free, none of them were truly safe. The night stretched into early morning. Catherine dozed fitfully on a cot in the sheriff's office, while Griffin and the others continued their discussions, planning for every contingency. The sounds of their low voices formed a reassuring backdrop to her troubled dreams. She was awakened by the first rays of dawn filtering through the office window and the smell of fresh coffee. Griffin sat nearby, his expression softening as he saw her stir. "Morning," he said, offering her a steaming cup. "How are you feeling?" Catherine accepted the coffee gratefully, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles from her fall the previous night. "I've been better," she admitted. "Any news?" Griffin's expression darkened. "Hargrove's still missing, but we've got a lead." A stable hand reported that he took his best horse late yesterday afternoon, hours before the ambush was supposed to take place. He never intended to be at the bridge, Catherine realized. No, he sent his men to do his dirty work while he made his escape. Griffin's jaw tightened. "But he won't get far. The sheriff's organized posses to search the surrounding area, and telegrams have been sent to every town within 100 miles. Catherine sipped her coffee, trying to process everything that had happened. "And Mrs. Holloway, is there any update on her condition?" "The doctor sent word about an hour ago. She's regained consciousness and is asking for you." Griffin smiled slightly. "She's apparently more concerned about your welfare than her own." Relief washed over Catherine. "Can I see her as soon as the sheriff returns?" "He doesn't want you moving around town unescorted until Hargrove is apprehended." Catherine nodded, understanding the caution even as she chafed at the restriction. "And what happens afterward? When Hargrove is caught?" Griffin was quiet for a moment, his green eyes studying her face. "That depends on several factors. The legal proceedings against Hargrove will take time. My testimony will be required." "So you'll stay in Copper Ridge?" Catherine asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. "For a while, yes." Griffin set his coffee cup aside, his expression turning serious. "Catherine, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have explained from the beginning." The gravity in his tone made Catherine's heart sink. "What is it?" Griffin took a deep breath. "I wasn't entirely honest about my background. Before my brother died in Hargrove's mine, I wasn't just a rancher. I was a Texas Ranger." Catherine blinked in surprise. A lawman, Griffin nodded. I resigned my commission after David's death when it became clear that the authorities had no interest in pursuing Hargrove. But my former captain has been supporting my investigation unofficially. Once Hargrove is in custody, he'll arrange for federal charges to be filed. Why didn't you tell me? Catherine asked, hurt by the omission even as she understood it. At first, I didn't know if I could trust you, Griffin admitted. Later, I wanted to protect you. The less you knew about my mission, the safer you would be if things went wrong. Catherine considered this, then nodded slowly. I understand, but no more secrets, Griffin. If we're to have any kind of future, it has to be built on honesty. Griffin's expression softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. A future? Is that something you want, Catherine, with me? Before she could answer, the door to the sheriff's office banged open. The sheriff entered, his expression grim. We've got trouble, he announced without preamble. Hargrove's been spotted heading back into town. Griffin was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. Where? Near the mining office. One of my deputies saw him entering through the back door about 20 minutes ago. Why would he come back? Catherine asked, bewildered. He must know you're looking for him. There's something at the office he needs, Griffin surmised. Something important enough to risk capture. The sheriff nodded. My thoughts exactly. I've got men surrounding the building, but I wanted to consult with you before moving in. Hargrove may be desperate, which makes him dangerous. Griffin turned to Catherine, conflict evident in his expression. I need to go with the sheriff, but I don't want to leave you unprotected. I'll be fine here, Catherine assured him, though her heart raced at the thought of him confronting Hargrove. Just be careful. Griffin hesitated, then stepped closer, his voice lowering so only she could hear. When this is over, Catherine, we'll have that conversation about the future, our future. He reached out, briefly squeezing her hand. That's a promise. Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as Griffin and the sheriff left, the door closing firmly behind them. Deputy Johnson remained, taking up position beside the door, his expression sympathetic. Don't worry, madam, he said kindly. Mr. Irwin can handle himself, and the sheriff's got plenty of men out there. Catherine tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. Thank you, Deputy. I'm sure you're right. But as the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, Catherine found herself unable to sit still. She paced the small office, jumping at every distant sound, imagining gunfire where there was none. After what felt like an eternity but was probably no more than half an hour, rapid footsteps approached the office. Deputy Johnson straightened, his hand moving to his gun. The door flew open to reveal another deputy, his expression urgent. Johnson, the sheriff needs backup at the mining office. Hargroves barricaded himself inside with hostages. Johnson hesitated, glancing at Catherine. I can't leave Mrs. Blackburn unprotected. Bring her along, the other deputy suggested. The sheriff set up a command post at the hotel across from the mining office. She'll be safe there and you can join the operation. Johnson considered this, then nodded. All right, Mrs. Blackburn, you'll need to come with us. Stay close and do exactly as I say. Catherine didn't hesitate. Anything was better than waiting alone, imagining the worst. Besides, being closer to the action meant being closer to Griffin. They hurried through town, the streets unusually quiet as word of the standoff spread. At the hotel, they found a flurry of activity, deputies coming and going, the sheriff issuing orders, townspeople gathering at a safe distance to watch the drama unfold. The mining office across the street was surrounded, lawmen positioned at every possible exit. Through the front windows, Catherine could see movement inside, though not clearly enough to distinguish individuals. How many hostages? Johnson asked as they joined the sheriff. 3, the sheriff replied grimly. The night watchman, the young clerk who arrived early for work, and— He hesitated, glancing at Catherine. And, she prompted, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Mr. Irwin, the sheriff admitted reluctantly. He was the first one in when we surrounded the building. Hargrove got the drop on him somehow. Catherine's heart seemed to stop. Griffin is a hostage. What is Hargrove demanding? Safe passage out of town, the sheriff explained. A horse, supplies, and a head start before we pursue him. Are you going to agree? The sheriff shook his head. We can't let him go, not after everything he's done. But we're stalling, trying to find a way to get our people out safely. Catherine stared across at the mining office, imagining Griffin in danger, perhaps injured. The thought was unbearable. Let me talk to him, she said suddenly. Absolutely not, the sheriff replied immediately. It's too dangerous. Hargrove wanted me before, Catherine pointed out. He might be willing to trade Griffin and the others for me. That's not an option, Mrs. Blackburn, the sheriff said firmly. I'm not putting you in harm's way. Before Catherine could argue further, a shout came from one of the deputies watching the building. Movement at the front door. All eyes turned to the mining office. The door had opened a crack, and a white handkerchief was being waved, the universal signal for parley. Hargrove wants to talk, the sheriff muttered, moving to the hotel entrance. Johnson, stay with Mrs. Blackburn. Make sure she doesn't do anything foolish. Catherine watched anxiously as the sheriff stepped out into the street, keeping his hands visible as he approached the midway point between the hotel and the mining office. The door of the mining office opened wider, and a figure emerged, not Hargrove, but the young clerk, his face pale with fear. He carried a folded piece of paper which he handed to the sheriff before scurrying back to the relative safety of the building. The sheriff read the note, his expression darkening. He returned to the hotel, his movements stiff with suppressed anger. What does it say? Catherine demanded. The sheriff hesitated, then handed her the note. See for yourself. It seems Hargrove knows you're here. Catherine unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The message was brief and chilling. Sheriff, I know Mrs. Blackburn is with you. Send her to me, alone and unarmed, and I'll release the clerk and the watchman. Irwin stays with me until I'm safely away. You have 15 minutes to decide, or I start shooting hostages. Hargrove horror washed over Catherine as she realized Hargrove intended to use her to ensure his escape, and that he planned to take Griffin with him, undoubtedly to kill him once they were safely away from town. I need to do it, she said, looking up at the sheriff. It's the only way to save the clerk and the watchman, and sacrifice yourself and Irwin in the process. No, the sheriff shook his head firmly. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Catherine argued. Not in 15 minutes. And I know Hargrove well enough to know he'll carry out his threat. Mrs. Blackburn, I can handle Hargrove, Catherine insisted. And once the other hostages are free, you'll have more options for rescuing Griffin and me. The sheriff studied her face, clearly torn between his duty to protect her and the lives of the innocent hostages. Irwin would never forgive me if I let you do this, he said finally. He would do the same in my position, Catherine countered. You know he would. After a long moment, the sheriff nodded reluctantly. All right, but we're not sending you in there without a plan. Over the next few minutes, they hastily formulated a strategy. Catherine would enter the mining office as Hargrove demanded, but she would be wearing a small Derringer pistol concealed in the folds of her skirt, a weapon small enough to escape notice in a cursory search, but potentially lethal at close range. Use it only as a last resort, the sheriff instructed as he showed her how to operate the tiny gun. Our priority is getting all the hostages out safely. Once the clerk and watchman are clear, We'll create a diversion to draw Hargrove's attention, giving you and Irwin a chance to escape or disarm him." Catherine nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The weight of the derringer against her thigh was both reassuring and terrifying. "It's time," the sheriff said grimly, glancing at his pocket watch. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Blackburn?" Catherine took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "I'm sure." With a final nod of encouragement, the sheriff escorted her to the hotel entrance. "Remember, stay calm and follow the plan. We'll be watching every moment." Catherine stepped out into the street, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The distance to the mining office seemed immense, each step carrying her closer to danger, closer to Griffin. "I'm coming in, Mr. Hargrove," she called, her voice remarkably steady despite her fear. "As you requested, I'm unarmed." The door opened, revealing Edgar Hargrove himself, a revolver in his hand. "Mrs. Blackburn, how kind of you to join us. Step inside slowly." Catherine obeyed, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light inside the office. The clerk and watchman were tied to chairs near the front window, their expressions reflecting a mixture of fear and hope at the sight of her. Griffin was nowhere to be seen. "Where is Mr. Irwin?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice level. Hargrove smiled unpleasantly. "Secure. You'll see him soon enough." He gestured with the gun. "Turn around, hands against the wall. I need to make sure you're not carrying any surprises." Catherine's heart raced as she complied, praying that the small derringer was sufficiently concealed in the folds of her skirt to escape detection. Hargrove's search was cursory, his hands moving quickly and impersonally over her arms and waist, but not lower. "Satisfactory," he pronounced. "Now move to the back office, slowly." As they passed the tied hostages, Catherine gave them a reassuring nod, hoping they understood that help was coming. Hargrove opened the door to the back office, shoving her inside. Griffin was there, seated in a chair, his hands tied behind him. A bruise was forming along his jawline, and a trickle of blood had dried at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes were alert and blazed with fury when he saw Catherine. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice rough. "Hargrove has no intention of letting any of us go." "Quiet, Irwin," Hargrove snapped. "Mrs. Blackburn made her choice." Catherine kept her expression neutral, though her heart soared at seeing Griffin alive. "I've fulfilled my part of the bargain, Mr. Hargrove. Release the clerk and the watchman as you promised." Hargrove studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Their usefulness has ended anyway." He stepped to the office door, keeping his gun trained on Griffin. "You two are free to go," he called to the hostages in the outer office. "Tell the sheriff he has 30 minutes to provide a horse and supplies at the back door, or Mrs. Blackburn dies." The sound of scrambling footsteps and the front door opening and closing indicated that the hostages had fled. Hargrove smiled, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Now we wait," he said, taking a seat behind the desk, his gun never wavering from Griffin. "I must say, Mrs. Blackburn, I'm impressed by your bravery. Foolish, but impressive." "Why did you come back?" Catherine asked, hoping to keep him talking while she assessed their options. "You could have been miles away by now." Hargrove's expression tightened momentarily. "There were documents I couldn't leave behind, financial records that would have provided evidence against me." "The ledgers," Griffin said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The real ones, not the doctored versions you show to investors. You kept them here in your office." "Precisely," Hargrove confirmed, a hint of smugness in his tone. "And now they're destroyed, along with any hope of proving your allegations." Catherine caught Griffin's eye, trying to communicate silently. The plan had been for her to create a distraction once the other hostages were free, giving the sheriff's men an opportunity to act. But with Hargrove positioned behind the desk, a clear shot through the window would be difficult, if not impossible. "It won't matter," Griffin said, drawing Hargrove's attention. "Your men are already talking, trading testimony for leniency." The ledgers would have been convenient, but they're not essential. Hargrove's expression darkened. "Loyalty is so rare these days, but it hardly matters. Once I'm across the border, neither you nor the law can touch me." "And what about us?" Catherine asked. "You must know the sheriff won't let you take us with you." "Mr. Irwin will be my insurance until I'm safely away," Hargrove replied coolly. "As for you, Mrs. Blackburn, I haven't decided. You could be useful companionship on a long journey." The implication made Catherine's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her hand inched toward the hidden derringer, ready to draw it if an opportunity presented itself. A sudden commotion from the front of the building made Hargrove tense. The sound of breaking glass was followed by shouts from the street. "What's happening?" he demanded, rising from his chair, gun pointed at Griffin. "What is this?" "The sheriff growing impatient, I imagine," Griffin replied with a calmness that Catherine knew was feigned. 30 minutes might have been optimistic. Hargrove strode to the office door, opening it a crack to peer into the front room. The momentary distraction was all Catherine needed. She drew the derringer from its hiding place and leveled it at Hargrove's back. "Drop your gun, Mr. Hargrove," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady despite the hammering of her heart. Hargrove froze, then slowly turned, his expression incredulous as he saw the tiny pistol in her hand. "Mrs. Blackburn, you continue to surprise me." "I said drop it," Catherine repeated, tightening her grip on the derringer. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, calculating. "That little popgun might kill me, but not before I put a bullet in your precious cowboy." He shifted his aim to Griffin. "Now be a sensible woman and put down the weapon." Catherine hesitated, torn between the need to disarm Hargrove and the very real possibility that he would shoot Griffin before she could stop him. The impasse was broken by a crash from the outer office, the sound of the front door being forced open. Hargrove whirled toward the noise, momentarily forgetting both Catherine and Griffin in his panic. In that instant, Griffin surged to his feet, his hands somehow free of their bonds. He launched himself at Hargrove, crashing into him with enough force to send them both tumbling to the floor. The gun went off, the report deafening in the confined space. Catherine cried out, fear clutching at her throat as she saw blood but whose she couldn't tell as the two men struggled on the floor. The back office door burst open, revealing the sheriff and two deputies, guns drawn. "Freeze!" The sheriff commanded, the struggle on the floor stilled. Griffin rolled away from Hargrove, who lay motionless, blood spreading across the front of his expensive shirt. "Griffin!" Catherine rushed forward, heedless of the danger. "Are you hurt?" Griffin winced as he sat up, clutching his side where blood stained his shirt. "Just a graze," he assured her, though his face was pale. "Hargrove!" The sheriff knelt beside the mine owner, checking for a pulse. "Dead," he pronounced after a moment. "Shot through the heart." Catherine stared at the derringer still clutched in her hand, horror washing over her as she realized what had happened. In the chaos of the struggle, she had fired instinctively, the bullet finding Hargrove even as he fought with Griffin. "I killed him," she whispered, the reality of it sinking in. I didn't mean to." Griffin struggled to his feet, ignoring the deputies who moved to help him, and went to Catherine. Gently, he took the gun from her shaking hand and passed it to the sheriff. "It was self-defense," he said firmly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "He was trying to kill both of us." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "Clear case of self-defense, Mrs. Blackburn. No one would think otherwise given the circumstances." Catherine nodded numbly, unable to tear her gaze away from Hargrove's lifeless body. She had taken a human life. However justified, it was a burden she would carry forever. Griffin seemed to understand her thoughts. "Let's get you out of here," he said quietly, guiding her toward the door. Outside, the bright sunshine was jarring after the dim office. Catherine blinked, disoriented as townspeople pressed forward, eager for news. "Give them space," the sheriff ordered, clearing a path through the crowd. "Mr. Irwin needs medical attention and Mrs. Blackburn requires rest. Doctor." Wilson, the town physician, hurried forward. "My office is closest. Bring them there." The next few hours passed in a blur for Catherine. She sat quietly in the doctor's waiting room while Griffin's wound was cleaned and bandaged, a flesh wound, as he had claimed, but one that had bled heavily and required several stitches. When he emerged from the examination room, his torso wrapped in clean bandages visible beneath his partially buttoned shirt, Catherine rushed to his side. "The doctor says I'll live," Griffin said with a faint smile, "though I'll be sore for a while." Catherine reached out tentatively, her fingertips brushing the edge of the bandage. "I thought, when the gun went off—" "I know." Griffin caught her hand, holding it against his chest. "But I'm all right, Catherine, and you were incredibly brave." Catherine shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I killed a man." "You saved my life," Griffin corrected gently. "And your own. Hargrove would have killed us both once we were beyond the sheriff's reach. You know that." Deep down, Catherine did know it. Hargrove had been a man without conscience, willing to destroy lives for profit and personal gain. Still, the act of taking a life even in self-defense was something she would need time to reconcile. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Griffin's expression softened. "Now we rest, heal." And then, he hesitated, his green eyes searching her face. "Then we have a conversation about the future if you're still willing." Despite everything, the trauma, the lingering shock, the exhaustion, Catherine felt a spark of hope ignite in her heart. "I'm willing," she whispered. The journey back to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was mercifully short. The landlady, recovered enough from her own ordeal to be up and about, fussed over both of them, insisting they eat and rest. "Absolutely no discussion of unpleasant matters until tomorrow," she declared firmly, serving them bowls of rich beef stew. "You both need nourishment and sleep." Catherine was grateful for the reprieve. The events of the past 24 hours had drained her completely, and the simple comfort of Mrs. Holloway's cooking and motherly concern was exactly what she needed. As dusk fell, Griffin reluctantly rose to leave. "I should let you rest," he said, standing in the doorway of the small parlor where they had eaten dinner. Catherine nodded, though part of her longed to ask him to stay. "Will I see you tomorrow?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Griffin promised, his expression warm. "Sleep well, Catherine." That night, Catherine expected nightmares, images of blood and violence, Hargrove's face as life left his body. Instead, she slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body and mind too exhausted for anything else. Morning brought a sense of renewal. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed to illuminate not just her room but her future, a future suddenly filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible just days before. After breakfast, she changed into her best dress, a modest blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her hair carefully. Mrs. Holloway watched with knowing eyes but made no comment beyond a gentle smile. Griffin arrived mid-morning, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt despite the obvious discomfort of his wound. In his hand, he carried a small bunch of wildflowers, which he presented to Catherine with a hint of shyness that was endearing in such a capable man. "I thought we might take a walk," he suggested, "if you're feeling up to it." Catherine accepted the flowers with a smile. "I'd like that." They strolled through town, past the now quiet mining office where workers had already begun to remove Hargrove's name from the sign, and toward the small park at the edge of town. The day was warm but pleasant, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and sage. "I spoke with the sheriff this morning," Griffin said as they walked. "The investigation into Hargrove's affairs is proceeding quickly. With the testimony of his men and the evidence Tom Michaels and I gathered, the full extent of his crimes is becoming clear." "Will the mine close?" Catherine asked, concerned for the livelihoods of the miners and their families. Griffin shook his head. "No, it's a viable operation, despite Hargrove's corruption. The bank is appointing a new manager to oversee things until ownership can be sorted out." They reached the park and found a bench beneath a large oak tree, its shade a welcome respite from the sun. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching a pair of sparrows flit between branches. "Catherine," Griffin began finally, turning to face her. "There's something I need to ask you." Catherine's heart quickened. "Yes, my investigation is over. Hargrove is dead and justice has been served as well as it can be." Griffin paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I came to Copper Ridge seeking vengeance for my brother, but I found something I wasn't looking for." "What was that?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A reason to move forward instead of looking back, a future worth building." Griffin took her hands in his. "I care for you, Catherine, deeply. More than I thought possible after all the bitterness and grief of the past years." Joy blossomed in Catherine's heart, warming her from within. "I care for you too, Griffin. I know your divorce proceedings have only just begun," Griffin continued. "And I would never ask you to compromise your reputation or principles, but when you're legally free, would you consider becoming my wife?" The directness of the proposal took Catherine's breath away. "Your wife, but what about Texas, your ranch?" "The ranch is still there," Griffin said with a smile. "My foreman has kept it running in my absence. We could build a life there, away from the memories and gossip of Copper Ridge, or we could start fresh somewhere else entirely." His expression grew serious. "The where matters less to me than the who, Catherine." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, tears of happiness, of relief, of a love she had never expected to find. "Yes," she whispered. "When I'm free, I would be honored to become your wife." Griffin's face transformed with joy. He leaned forward, one hand gently cupping her cheek, and kissed her a tender, reverent kiss that held both promise and passion. When they parted, Catherine felt as though she were floating, her heart so full it might burst. "How long must we wait?" she asked, reluctant to release his hand. "Judge Wilson estimates 3 months for the divorce to be finalized, assuming Frank doesn't contest it." Griffin's expression darkened briefly at the mention of her husband, then cleared. "In the meantime, I'll return to Texas to put my affairs in order, make preparations for our life together." A pang of anxiety shot through Catherine at the thought of him leaving, even temporarily. "You'll come back." Griffin's gaze was steady and sincere. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he repeated his promise from the night before. "I'll return with the first blossoms of spring, and we'll be married as soon as your divorce is final." The months that followed were both the longest and shortest of Catherine's life. True to his word, Griffin departed for Texas after 2 weeks, leaving her with a gold band on a chain around her neck, not yet an engagement ring, but a token of his promise to return. During his absence, Catherine threw herself into building her seamstress business and finalizing her divorce. Frank had indeed left town, as Griffin had ordered, and never responded to the published notices. Judge Wilson, true to his word, granted the divorce by default after the required waiting period. Letters came regularly from Texas, each one filled with Griffin's plans for their future and declarations of his growing affection. Catherine read them until the paper wore thin, carrying them close to her heart during the long winter months. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the return of birdsong to the trees around Copper Ridge. And with it came Griffin, arriving on a fine chestnut horse, his smile as warm as the April sun when he caught sight of Catherine waiting on the boarding house porch. Their wedding took place on a perfect May morning, with Mrs. Holloway acting as Catherine's matron of honor and Thomas Michaels standing up for Griffin. Judge Wilson performed the ceremony in the town's small church, which was filled with well-wishers for, despite the scandal of her divorce, Catherine had earned the respect of the community through her hard work and quiet dignity. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared, his usually stern face softened with genuine pleasure. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Irwin." As Griffin's lips met hers, Catherine felt the final pieces of her heart and life fall into place. From the darkness of her first marriage had come the greatest light, a love founded on respect, honesty, and mutual admiration. 2 weeks later, they departed Copper Ridge for Texas, where Griffin's ranch awaited them. The journey was long but filled with joy as they planned their future together, the family they hoped to create, the life they would build. 5 years later, Catherine stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Griffin taught their 4-year-old son, David, named for the uncle he would never meet, to sit astride a gentle pony. Their 2-year-old daughter, Margaret, named for Mrs. Holloway, who had become like a mother to Catherine, played at her feet. The ranch had prospered under Griffin's careful management, becoming one of the most successful in the county. Catherine's skills as a seamstress had found new purpose in creating clothing for their children, and the occasional special commission from neighboring ranchers' wives. As she watched her husband lift their laughing son from the pony, Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, where their third child had just begun to make its presence known. She hadn't told Griffin yet, saving the news for that evening when they would be alone. Griffin looked up, catching her eye across the yard. The love that passed between them was as strong and clear as it had been on their wedding day, perhaps even stronger, tempered by the challenges they had faced and the life they had built together. In that moment, Catherine felt a profound gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought Griffin into her life on that desperate day when Frank had tried to sell her to Hargrove. What had begun as the darkest chapter of her life had become the prologue to the greatest love story she could have imagined. As Griffin approached with David on his shoulders and a smile that still made her heart race, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had rescued her in every way a person could be saved. And as he leaned in to kiss her, their children giggling around them in the golden Texas sunlight, Griffin Irwin knew that some contracts like the one binding their hearts together were meant to last forever.